This is Mary White Ovington. She's a suffragette, a socialist, a Unitarian, a journalist, author, and co-founder of the NAACP. Now, depending on your source, there may be 2 co-founders of the NAACP, 3, 4, or 8. But no matter what your source is, Mary White Ovington is always one of them. Of course, she was also a Unitarian, and that's why she made it to this series of sermons. This was my major source, was her own book. This book is called Black and White Sit Down Together, and it has a double meaning, which you will see later on as I move forward and tell you a little more about her story. It was not actually a book that she put together, but it's by her. This is a book that was made up of newspaper entries that she was writing for a column for a newspaper in 1932 and 1933, reminiscing about the NAACP and its founding and her own life. And then in 1995, someone said, you know, we should put all those columns together because it would be a good book for someone to have like me who's trying to study her. And I'm very grateful for that. So this is my major source for Mary White Ovington. She really was a Unitarian. Now, we sometimes as Unitarian Universalists want to claim anybody that walked through the door or maybe just talked about Unitarian Universalism or that we gave an honorary Unitarian Universalism identity to some way. But she really was a Unitarian, growing up attending the Second Unitarian Church in Brooklyn. This is a picture of it. This is the church she actually attended. She was heavily influenced by its minister, John White Chadwick. She attended with her parents and her 3 siblings. They were church-going people. They went to this Unitarian church. It was a liberal Unitarian church, and this gave her many of her values, just as we hope our children are getting theirs right now as they're back there in their classes. She was educated at the prestigious Packard Collegiate Institute. Now, I'd never heard of it, but I've looked it up. It's still going, Packard Collegiate Institute. It was then a private school in Brooklyn for girls. It's now co-ed. Some of you, Janice, you know about this? No? Okay. Well, you're shaking your head just because you're trying to encourage me, right? That's I appreciate that. So it's now co-ed. Now this, as you might imagine, just even looking by this picture, not just anybody could go to a school like this. But her parents were wealthy and could afford the very best. And this is where they sent her to school. While she was still at the Institute in high school in 1890, she was fortunate to hear a speech by Frederick Douglass, which she said greatly impacted her to do work that helped others. She said after that she wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she wanted to do something for the betterment of others. She introduces one of her books with a story about how she and a male friend that hurt him viewed him very differently, especially the fact that at that time he was married to a white woman, which the male friend disagreed with and thought that was wrong, and she agreed with and thought it was fine. So they had this ongoing discussion. And do you know some people today are still discussing that? My goodness. Then she continued her studies at Radcliffe College in Cambridge. Of course, this is the sister school for Harvard. Again, it was very prestigious. That's where she went. She was influenced by Sir William Ashley. He was an economics history professor. She had to lead, this is his picture in the corner. Now, she had to leave that school before completing her degree because her family ran into some financial difficulty. So they said, come on back home for a while. Back in Brooklyn, though, she said, I'm ready to go to work. And she began to say, what can I do? She began to prepare herself to go into social work of some kind. She was inspired by Unitarian Jane Addams and her work at the Hull House. You may have heard of her. I know we used to study her in education. This place is still there. It's a settlement house in Chicago. And her work, Jane Addams' work with immigrants. You can go there and have a tour. And actually, one of my friends, I maybe shouldn't say this, but Bill Ayers, who I may have become a friend with over the time at Georgia Southern. Do y'all know who he is? He is on the board of this and said if any of us go up there, he'll help us tour around that place. So that's in Chicago. She said, I want to do that same kind of work. After working as a secretary for the Pratt Institute for a year, Frederick B. Pratt, knowing she wanted to do this, offered Ovington the opportunity of beginning a settlement house at his tenement in Greenpoint. And this is the actual picture of that I found of that tenement. So Jane Addams gave her advice. She talked to others who had settlement houses. They gave her advice. She moved in here. She lived there for 7 years with them in the house, in the tenement house with the folks, worked with those immigrants, and was proud to do so, that she was doing the kind of work that she had wanted to do. But a particular encounter happened that led her to refocus her work. She had some of the immigrants with her, and they were on a field trip going somewhere. And as they went along, they went through a neighborhood, an African-American neighborhood. And these immigrant children, who she thought were all good children, who she was trying to give them, encourage them with good values, and who were themselves in an oppressed group, when they rode by and they saw the African-American kids, they would use the N-word, which just appalled. She was so shocked. And then she said something to it, and they said, this is just a game we play. And that they really went, whenever, like you see the Volkswagen Bug and say something, it was a game they had learned somewhere along the way. And she realized that even though she was working with a group that needed help, there were some that needed even more. And she decided to refocus her life to work in some way with African Americans. Ovington was chair of a committee that was going to arrange a speech in New York by Washington in 1903, Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington was very famous not only for his school, but for raising money. He would go up north to these wealthy people, and he raised a lot of money. And he was so good at it and became so well acquainted with these donors that had the money that other folks wanting to raise money for their schools would have to get an introduction that they were okay by Booker T. Washington to even get started with it. Well, he was coming then in 1903 to have a speech, and his speech at that time convinced her that she must shift her work and she must start working on the improvement of conditions for African Americans. Now, the public schools by then in Greenpoint had taken over much of the work that she had been doing with the immigrant children there. So don't feel too sorry for them for her shifting her work. They had began to take over that, and she thought, this is a good time to shift my work. Well, she knew she needed to raise money to do the work. You have to have money if you're going to. She thought maybe we'll have a settlement house. I'll do something like that with them or something else. So here's a quote about what happened when she was trying to discover about how can I raise money so I can do this work that I want to do. She said, I had never had to raise money, and I was at a loss of how to begin to interest people. So I went to one of my wisest settlement friends and asked her advice. She, in turn, asked me what I knew of Negro conditions. I confessed that I knew nothing. Whereupon she advised that I study the Negro in New York and made this practical by securing a fellowship for me. And how many times do some of us decide we're going to help somebody, some group, and we really don't know understand what the needs are or anything else. We just come in with our white privileged self sometimes, say, oh, I'm going to help you, not having any idea. And they said, she said, you can't do this. You don't have any idea about what you're doing. You got to study this. She gave her a fellowship to do it, and so then Mary White Ovington began her studies. She knew she had to get to know folks first, though. She had to really get to know folks. And she tried. She tried writing to some folks that she had heard of that lived in New York. Now, these were prominent African Americans saying, can I meet with you? Some of them didn't respond, but this is one person that did, Fred R. Moore. Fred Moore was the editor of the New York Age, and he met with her, and he not only met with her, he helped her. Then once she knew him, he could give her an in with others so she could meet with others. So she began to connect. At first, connect with these very well-educated African Americans that these folks like Fred Moore connected her with. And she began to write for the New York Evening Post. A lot of the time, at that time, a lot of information that was written about African Americans was very negative. So she thought it was necessary to counter that. And she was studying and learning, and she would write articles to counter this as she learned more and more. She became friends with both Booker T. Washington, who advised her on how to raise money, and W.B. Du Bois, who she frequently corresponded. There are letters, actual letters, here's one of them, that you can see on the internet. Thankfully, she typed her letters, so you can actually read them. You know, some of these things people have said, you can read these letters. Here's one of them where she's writing to him, and this is in 1906. This is when he was in Atlanta, at the university there. That was one of the ones that did not follow Booker T. Washington's ideas about how African Americans should be educated, because they had a disagreement. If you studied education, you studied that disagreement they had. Booker T. Washington was much more with the idea that you should educate people for the jobs they can probably get, and you should, serve them where they're planted, that kind of thing. You don't need to, there's going to be very few that need higher education, so they don't need a lot of academics. W.E.B. Du Bois felt very differently about that, so they had this thing going on, and people would take sides. She was friends with both of them, though. But the more she got to know Du Bois, the less she began to lean more toward his ideas and less toward Booker T. Washington's. Ovington chose to move to a tenement in San Juan Hill section of New York. Just as she had moved before to really get to know people, most of the people she knew were well-educated folks. She said, no, if I want to help people, I need to move into the areas where they live. So she chose to move to this tenement in San Juan Hill, and you can imagine the reason it was called San Juan Hill, because there was so much fighting going on all the time. So it was a rough neighborhood. She decided to move there. She moved there, moved into a tenement, and she started a child care program in that place. Now, her experiences there in that tenement, trying to help those children, helped to round out her education, because she got to know folks in the neighborhood well, not just the well-educated folks, but all the folks, and she began to have a better understanding. The result of all her study was a book, because remember, she'd gotten a fellowship to do this, and you academics know if somebody gives you money to do something, you got to follow through with the report, right? So her book was called Half a Man, The Status of the Negro in New York. And of course, we're using words that were used at that time. This is the book. You can still buy this book. She gets her title from an interaction with a college student who had recently returned from Germany. The college student, this was an African-American college student who had been over to Germany, and he came back. He was actually from the South, though, and he was living in New York. And she asked him if he was going back home to the South to teach. Now that he had all his teaching credentials, she said, will you go back to the South to teach? He said this: my father has attained success in his native state, but when I ceased to be a boy, he advised me to live in the North, where my manhood would be respected. He himself cannot continually endure the position in which he is placed, and in the summer, he comes north to be a man. No, correcting himself, to be half a man. A Negro is wholly a man only in Europe. So he'd been to Germany, had experienced what life was like for him there, had then come to New York and realized that even in the North, that you were not treated as fully as you were as a man. So she titled her book Half a Man because of that. The rest of her book shares data and problems of those living in New York, and it was very well received because many people then use that. You have to have that data before you can try to raise money, as many of you know, to actually help folks. So she had the data then that others could use and she could use herself. There was an incident that she became very famous for, or infamous for, maybe I should say. So I've titled this part, That Cosmopolitan Club Dinner, Oh My. Now, in New York back at that time, different restaurants would have clubs that would meet at certain times at the restaurants. Well, we have things like that in Statesboro, don't we? The Lions Club meets at a restaurant, yeah. So they would have clubs that meet at restaurants, and these were social clubs a lot of times. where folks would get together. Maybe they'd have a speaker, maybe they'd have a discussion. That's what the Cosmopolitan Club was. On the evening of April 27, 1908, the Cosmopolitan Society of New York City gave a banquet at Peck's Restaurant on Fulton Street, in which colored and white people sat together at each table. Editor Holt, in an address at this banquet, advocated intermarriage as a solution to the race problem and was vociferously applauded. He said in part, "When the colored people get educated, the whites in the South will have to recognize them as their equals. What must be the remedy?" And he was proposing intermarriage as one of the remedies. Also reported were Mary White Ovington's words, and this is how she is quoted for her words. She said, "Move your chairs closer together and get up closer. I like to think that we're going to eat with and stand up for our colored brothers and sisters wherever and whenever we meet them, or whenever we can, or wherever we can. We hope to have many such clubs soon. I believe it would be a terrible state of affairs when the Negro gives up any of his rights as a man. He should never be satisfied until equality is recognized, till his equality is recognized." Again, using those male pronouns of the day that we probably would change now. So the dinner was reported far and wide, and these quotes were reported far and wide. The worst report was the Savannah News. Now, I don't know what the Savannah newspaper was doing, reporting on a New York social event, but they were. And this is what they said in the Savannah News. They referred to her as, quote, "the high priestess, Miss Ovington, whose father is rich and who affiliates 5 days in every week with Negro men and dines with them at her home in Brooklyn on Sunday." So that was the big scandal. And for a while, it followed her around. And that's how people had read all this news, and that was what they thought about. So one reason this book, it's got a double meaning. Black and white sat down together because that's what people were talking about a lot about her, how they were eating together, sat down together, that was in this club. But also because that's what happened in the founding of the NAACP. So it has a double meaning there. Her life, however, was profoundly changed by an article written by another in 1908. His name was William English Walling, and he penned a piece about a racial attack in Springfield, Illinois, on the town's African-American residents. This riot left 7 people dead and destroyed dozens and dozens of others of homes. She contacted him because she thought, I need to find out more. She was so upset about it. And he suggested that she contact Dr. Henry Moskowitz and that the 3 of them meet and try to figure something out. When I read that, it sort of reminded me of when Joe Bill Brannon called me after Ferguson, Missouri situation and said, "Jane, this could happen in Statesboro." And I said, "Well, yeah, it surely could." And so he called up Johnny Trimble, who was working with him that time at the food bank, and the 3 of us sat down together, and from that, it grew more and more, and that's where the beloved community came from. So it was, something getting your attention and saying, wow, this is horrible. What are we going to do? What can we do? So they sat down together, and they formed what they call the National Negro Committee. And the National Negro Committee was the predecessor to the NAACP. They sent out a call, and this is timely, this is February 11th. They sent out a call on February 12th. Whose birthday is that? Lincoln. It's also Darwin's, but they weren't thinking about Darwin. Darwin and Lincoln were not only had the same birthday, they were born in the same year. So that's neither here nor there. But it was Lincoln's birthday. Just a little tidbit of information. It was Lincoln's birthday, and so they put out the call on Lincoln's birthday for a conference that they were going to hold in May of that year and invited folks to come, including prominent black and white reformers. Those folks came together, and they formed what would later be called the NAACP. By May 1910, the National Negro Committee, it was still called, and attendance at its second conference organize a permanent body that they then called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, Mary White Ovington reports that she did not like that title. It was too long. She said, even if you just call it by the letters, it's too long. But it stuck, and as you know, we've still got it. That's where it is. She was appointed later as its executive secretary. She actually was on the board, not only co-founder and on the board, but she was on, when somebody else would lead the staff, she would take their place. If they didn't have enough money that somebody had to leave, she would take their place. They placed their founding, those of you that are members of the NAACP know, they placed their founding actually in 1909. And that is when the group met first, but they did not call themselves the NAACP at that time. But kind of like Georgia Southern decided to go back when they found a letter that was 1906. We used to say it was founded in 1908. Well, you want it early as it can be. Well, oh no, here's the letter when it first got something happened. So we'll go to 1906. So it's considered being found in 1909. Now, when you talk about 8 folks, these are the folks. Mary White Ovington is the one on the left, John Haynes Holmes, Moorfield Story, Ida Wells Barnett, who'd been working for some time with anti-lynching kinds of stuff. Henry Moskowitz, Oswald Garrison Willard, William Henry Walling, the man that wrote that initial article that caught her attention, and of course, W.B. Du Bois. They led the call out to others to renew the struggle for civil and political liberty. This is a marker at the points of light pathway. You remember when Bush came up with these, had folks doing these points of light, that people that had these charities and things, and he recognized them. I didn't realize it also went back historically and recognized folks. And they have a point of light pathway with all these people historically who had done some great things. So she is pictured here with Du Bois and information about them founding the NAACP. She has a chapter, there's a chapter in this book that's called I Go South, because this became a very important part of her work. She says, this is a quote, the Southerner, now we hear this too, the Southerner likes to tell the Northerner who studies the Negro question that he was not born in the South. You know, you don't know what you're talking about. If you were here, you would know, well, you'd understand, you know. He was not born in the South. She said, well, I couldn't change that, but I could go south and try to learn what made that land so different that the whites clung to chattel slavery after the rest of the world had repudiated it. I knew the reason given by the Southern slaveholder that the Negro was of an inferior race and capable of higher education, working only under compulsion. This made the slave block possible. I would study conditions south of the Mason and Dixon line. So she began to do that. Now, she went south actually before they started the NAACP, when she was just studying. She went south then, and then once they organized the NAACP, time and time again she went south. One of her jobs that she held at the NAACP was branch director, so she would go south to help organize these branches. And she would live with the members of the NAACP, usually African Americans. They would protect her because she was putting herself in a lot of danger, and she was putting them in a lot of danger. They usually, when she would go out to go somewhere, they would have a woman go with her. And she wondered about that, you know, I always send a woman with me. Well, one time she was out with a man and somebody stopped and she started shouting and they had to go run their way. She realized then, oh my, if they send a man with me, I am very much endangering his life. So she began to understand how things really were in the South. She loved certain aspects of the South and certainly the people she was working with, but she got very frustrated with the South in 1918 when the head of the NAACP at that time was beaten up in Austin. So that greatly frustrated her with the South. Besides her many contributions to the NAACP, Ovington left behind a substantial body of work, including numerous essays and articles. In addition to Half a Man, here are some others. The Shadow is Fiction. The Walls Came Tumbling Down. That came after her retirement and told about the NAACP's founding. The one I'm using a lot today, Hazel, also that's a book for adolescents about a young girl. Portraits in Color, that's about a lot of heroes of the movement at that time. Socialism and the Feminist Movement, The Upward Path, The Awakening, which is a play, also many essays, short stories, articles, and free verse. And I'm going to read to you something out of here, even though we were late on time a little bit because I think it's important. This is an example of her free verse. You heard of Mary Fagan? This is a Georgia story. Okay. So Mary Fagan was a 13-year-old pencil factory worker near Atlanta, and she was supervised by a Jewish man, Leo Frank. I won't give you all the details of it, but she was found in the basement dead. They suspected various people. He was the one, though, although he maintained his innocence, and others thought he was too, based on that but he was the one convicted. It went on appeals. The governor at the time, because of what he heard in the appeals, commuted the death sentence to life imprisonment. He was sent to a prison in Milledgeville. The people from her hometown, from Marietta, went down to Milledgeville, kidnapped him, took him back up there, and hung him. Nothing happened to any of those men. That's an actual picture, and you can see who they are. Nothing ever happened to any of them. Now, this is what she wrote about it, though. It's Mary Fagan Speaks, and it's as if she's speaking from the grave. And here's what she says. You care a lot about me, you men of Georgia, now that I am dead. You have spent thousands of dollars trying to learn who mutilated my body. You have filled the columns of your newspapers with the story of my wrong. You have broken into a prison and murdered a man that I might be avenged. But why did you not care for me when I was alive? I was a child, but you shut me out of the daylight. You held me within four walls, watching a machine that crashed through the air, endlessly watching a knife as it cut a piece of wood. Noise fills the place, noise, dust, and the smell of oil. I wish some of the thousands of dollars that you spent on the trial might have been spent keeping me in school. A real school, the kind you build for the rich. I worked through the hot August days when you were bossing the girls or shooting birds or lounging in the doorways cursing the N-word, and you never paid me enough to buy a pretty dress. You sometimes spoke coarsely to me when I went to and from my work. Yes, you did, and I had to pretend to like it. Why did you despise me living and yet love me so now? I think I know. It is like what the preacher told me about Christ. People hated him when he was alive, but when he was dead, they killed man after man for his sake. So you can see the kind of writing she does. Very powerful. I usually, when I do these, share some quotes with you of the people that I think are just as relevant today. Now, but Mary White Ovington doesn't have a lot of little pithy statements. So I don't have a little pithy quotes. You have to really read her stuff, okay? But I did have one I'll share with you, and this is it. Judas is not at the bottom of my inferno. That's one. So here she is. Mary White Ovington. She retired as a board member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1947, and in doing so, she ended decades of service within the organization, at the age of 82. She worked till she was 82. And then my understanding, it wasn't an easy retirement where she said, oh, I think I'll retire now, bye. It was one of those where she was, you gotta go, at 82. Here's what Henry Wheeler wrote about her at that time in the St. Louis American. He suggested that the organization declare a Mary White Ovington Day. She was, he claimed, the person who has done more to make America the land of the free and the home of the brave than any other living soul. She died in 1951. And her ashes are in the chapel of Community Church, Unitarian Universalist, New York City. She's definitely one of us still. We still have her. Now, if you look at this picture, it looks like a UU chapel with the stacking chairs, doesn't it? But it also has these things on the wall. I don't know if you can see it. It looks like placing the wall with some metal there. I wonder if that's where they put ashes of folks. And I was thinking we could dig some places out along here, and, have the little, who knows? Anyway, may her ashes and the knowledge of her life and work inspire us to help move that moral arc of the universe just a little bit more toward justice. Amen, and blessed be.